It was a quiet afternoon in the heart of Maplewood, a neighborhood known for its tight-knit community and tranquil streets. The sun was casting long golden rays over the town square, where people bustled about their day, unaware that a storm was brewing nearby, one that would turn an ordinary day into something no one would forget. Angela Carter, a warm-hearted, no-nonsense mother of two, had just finished her shift at the local diner. Her tired feet carried her to her car, parked just outside the small grocery store where she planned to pick up a few things for dinner. She wasn't the type to let a tough day dim her spirit. With her usual friendly smile, she greeted an elderly man who held the door open for her as she entered the store. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to cross paths with someone who didn't share her kindness, a man who carried prejudice like a badge of honor. Officer Derek Logan, a long-serving cop with a reputation that split the town in two, was parked nearby, idling in his squad car. To some, Derek was a hard-working officer doing his job. To others, he was a walking reminder of what was wrong with the system. His brusque attitude and overreach of authority had earned him criticism, but his position shielded him, until today. Angela's son, Marcus, had recently returned to town. A Marine Corps veteran and a towering presence, Marcus was known for his calm demeanor and deep sense of justice. He had been the pride of his family and community, but also someone who had seen enough of life to know when things weren't right. That sense of justice had often led him to stand up for others, no matter the cost. Inside the store, Angela went about her shopping, unaware that Officer Logan had been observing her from his car. For reasons unknown, whether it was his bias or an unfounded suspicion, Derek decided Angela was someone who needed to be questioned. As Angela exited the store with her groceries, Logan approached her, his uniform sharp, his tone sharp. "Ma'am, can I have a word?" He barked, his voice carrying an air of authority that made Angela pause. Surprised, but not intimidated, Angela placed her bags on the hood of her car. "Is something wrong, officer?" she asked, her voice steady but confused. Derek's tone was cold, almost accusatory. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. Can I see some ID?" Angela frowned, genuinely baffled. "Suspicious activity? I just got off work and stopped to pick up groceries. Is there a problem?" she asked, still maintaining her composure. But Derek's persistence began to draw the attention of nearby onlookers. His questions became more invasive, his tone more forceful. Angela, with her natural grace, stood her ground. "Officer, if you don't have a reason to detain me, I'd like to leave," she said firmly. That's when things took a turn. Derek, perhaps frustrated by Angela's refusal to cower, overstepped his bounds. He reached out, roughly grabbing her wrist, and before anyone could process what was happening, a loud slap echoed in the air. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Angela stumbled back, her hand instinctively going to her cheek. "Enough!" A voice thundered, freezing everyone in their tracks. Heads turned toward the source of the voice, and there he was, Marcus. Standing tall, his presence alone was enough to command the entire scene. His eyes locked onto Derek with a fire that couldn't be ignored. Derek's face drained of color as he recognized the man approaching him. This wasn't just some passerby. This was someone who radiated authority and strength, someone who clearly wasn't going to let this slide. Marcus's voice was calm, but filled with an unmistakable edge. "Officer, what's going on here?" he asked, his tone carrying the weight of someone who demanded answers. Derek, visibly shaken, stammered, "This is police business. Stand back." Marcus didn't flinch. His gaze shifted to his mother, who was still clutching her cheek, and his jaw tightened. The tension in the air was suffocating as the crowd watched, waiting to see what would happen next. "Would you like me to continue, or adjust anything? Would you like me to continue, or adjust anything?" Derek's hand hovered near his belt, as if considering whether to reach for his radio or something more threatening. But Marcus's unwavering stance made him hesitate. The man in front of him wasn't an ordinary civilian. Marcus exuded an air of discipline and power that came not just from his physical presence, but from something deeper, a lifetime of standing for what was right. Angela finally found her voice. "Marcus, it's fine. Let's not make this worse," she said softly, her voice trembling but strong enough to carry the weight of her concern. Rodriguez opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Logan snapped. "I've had enough of this," he shouted, his voice tinged with desperation. He reached for his holster, a move that sent a wave of panic through the crowd. "Don't," Marcus shouted, stepping in front of his mother, his arms raised protectively. The crowd surged backward, fear rippling through them like a wave. Jenkins lunged forward, grabbing Logan's arm before he could draw his weapon. "What are you doing?" he hissed, his voice low and urgent. "Do you want to make this worse?" Logan yanked his arm free, his face a mask of rage and fear. "They're out to get me," he muttered, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. "All of them." Rodriguez stepped between Logan and the crowd, his voice deadly calm. "That's enough, Logan. You're done here." Logan froze, his breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, it looked like he might resist, but then he seemed to deflate, his shoulders sagging as the weight of the situation finally sank in. Rodriguez turned to Jenkins. "Take him to the car," he said. "Now." As Logan was led away, the crowd erupted again, their cheers and shouts blending into a cacophony of emotion. But Marcus didn't cheer. He stood silently, his eyes fixed on Rodriguez. "This isn't over," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "Not by a long shot." Rodriguez nodded, his expression grim. "You're right," he said. "It's not." The night wasn't over, and the battle for justice had only just begun. Would you like to continue toward the climax, or explore more perspectives in this escalating conflict? The crowd's chants echoed into the night as Logan was escorted to the back of the squad car, his head hanging low, a stark contrast to the domineering figure he'd been just hours before. For many, his removal from the scene felt like a small victory, but the tension still lingered thick in the air. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about years of pain, injustice, and systemic failure. Everyone there knew that. Marcus stood silently beside his mother, his protective stance unyielding. Angela had begun to relax slightly, her trembling hand finally finding its way to her son's arm. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward again, addressing the crowd with a voice meant to carry authority. "Officer Logan is being removed from this situation, and an immediate investigation will begin. I give you my word, this will not be ignored." But the crowd wasn't satisfied. Someone shouted, "We've heard that before." Another voice followed, "What happens after tonight?" Rodriguez looked momentarily lost for words, his usual command of a situation slipping away under the weight of the community's doubt. The chants began to swell again, louder and angrier, and Marcus could feel the energy shifting dangerously. Kayla, the journalist, pushed her way to the front, her camera still rolling. "Captain Rodriguez," she called out, her voice cutting through the noise. "Do you believe Officer Logan's actions were justified tonight? The people here want answers." Rodriguez hesitated, his jaw tightening as he glanced at the camera. "This isn't the place to make those determinations," he said carefully. "That's why we have protocols, investigations." "And those protocols are the problem." Marcus's voice boomed, silencing the crowd. He stepped forward, his presence commanding everyone's attention. "You keep hiding behind protocols to avoid accountability. If you really wanted to fix this, you'd start by being honest." The captain's eyes locked with Marcus's, the weight of the moment pressing down on both men. For a moment, it seemed like Marcus's words might break through the wall of bureaucracy, that perhaps there was a chance for change. But before Rodriguez could respond, Harper, the outspoken detective, stepped forward again, his voice brimming with urgency. "Captain, there's something you need to see," Harper said, holding up a small USB drive. "This isn't just about tonight. Logan's been a ticking time bomb for years, and this proves it." The crowd buzzed with confusion and curiosity. Kayla immediately zeroed in on the exchange, her camera capturing every second. "What's on that drive?" she asked, her voice sharp and probing. Harper hesitated, glancing at Rodriguez. "It's internal footage," he admitted. "Body cam videos, incident reports, everything they've been sweeping under the rug. And it's not just Logan. This is bigger than one man." "Marcus," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Please, come with me. Let's go home." But Marcus didn't move, his eyes never leaving Derek. "I'm not going anywhere, Mom. Not until this is made right." The sirens grew louder, and the crowd braced themselves for what was to come. Angela clutched her grocery bags tightly, her knuckles white as she prayed for a resolution that wouldn't cost her the son she loved more than anything. As the first patrol car pulled up, its lights flashing, Marcus stood tall, unshaken. The battle wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. "Would you like me to continue or refine any part of this continuation?" The second patrol car rolled to a stop, and two officers stepped out, their expressions shifting between confusion and concern as they took in the scene. Officer Jenkins, a younger cop with a reputation for keeping a level head, was the first to approach. He glanced at the growing crowd, the phone cameras, and finally at Officer Logan, who looked pale and defensive. "What's going on here, Logan?" Jenkins asked, his voice calm but firm. Derek hesitated, fumbling for words. "Just a misunderstanding," he said quickly, waving a hand as if to dismiss the entire ordeal. "The situation is under control." "Doesn't look under control," Jenkins replied, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the scene. His gaze settled on Marcus, who stood protectively in front of Angela, his posture unwavering. Jenkins didn't need much time to piece things together. Logan's reputation had preceded him. Angela took a step forward, her voice trembling but resolute. "This officer stopped me for no reason, grabbed me, and struck me when I asked him to explain himself." Her hand brushed her cheek, the redness still visible. "And now he's trying to act like it's no big deal." Jenkins's jaw tightened as he looked at Derek. He'd heard whispers about Logan's behavior before, but this was different. There were witnesses, plenty of them, and the tension in the air was unmistakable. He knew the situation could spiral out of control if not handled carefully. Marcus, sensing Jenkins' attempt to mediate, spoke up. "Your colleague assaulted my mother. We're not going anywhere until there's accountability." Jenkins nodded slowly, keeping his hands visible to show he wasn't here to escalate things further. "I understand," he said, his tone measured. "Let's take a moment to figure this out." Derek, however, wasn't ready to back down. "We don't need to figure anything out," he snapped. "I was doing my job. She was being uncooperative." "Uncooperative," Marcus repeated, his voice rising slightly. "She's a middle-aged woman buying groceries. What about that screams uncooperative to you?" The crowd murmured again, their voices growing louder as frustration bubbled to the surface. Jenkins held up a hand, signaling for calm. "All right," he said, directing his words toward Marcus and Angela. "Let's step aside and talk this through. We can file a report, make sure everything is documented." Angela hesitated, her instinct to protect Marcus clashing with her own sense of justice. "And what happens then?" she asked, her voice laced with doubt. "Does anything actually change? Or does he just walk away, ready to do this to someone else?" Jenkins didn't answer right away. He knew the weight of her question, knew how many times people like Angela had been let down by promises of accountability that never came. "I can't undo what happened," he said finally, "but I can make sure it doesn't get ignored." Marcus glanced at his mother, searching her face for guidance. He trusted her judgment more than anything, but he couldn't shake the anger simmering just beneath the surface. Every fiber of his being told him to stand firm, to demand justice on the spot. But then Angela placed a hand on his arm, grounding him in a way only a mother could. "Fine," Marcus said after a long pause. "We'll talk, but only if it's all out in the open. No backroom conversations, no sweeping it under the rug." Jenkins nodded. "Fair enough. Let's start by getting everyone's statements. The crowd, still watching intently, didn't budge. If anything, more people arrived, drawn by the spectacle of flashing lights and raised voices. Among them was Kayla, a local journalist who had a knack for being in the right place at the right time. She moved quietly through the gathering, her phone recording as she took in every detail. She recognized the broader implications of what was happening here. This wasn't just about one incident. This was about a pattern, one that people were finally tired of ignoring. Meanwhile, Derek stood to the side, his frustration mounting. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, and the presence of his fellow officers only made his position feel more precarious. He glanced at Jenkins, who was now speaking calmly with Angela and Marcus, and felt a flicker of resentment. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He was, "Would you like me to continue to the climax or focus on refining this build-up further?" The question lingered in the air, innocent but powerful, drawing everyone's attention for a brief moment. It was as though the child's voice had pierced through the heavy tension, a stark reminder of what was really at stake. But the momentary stillness was shattered when the sound of another car door slamming echoed through the square. A sleek, unmarked vehicle had arrived, and stepping out was a figure who immediately commanded attention: Captain Rodriguez, the head of the precinct. Rodriguez was a seasoned officer, known for his no-nonsense demeanor and his reputation for cutting through the noise. He surveyed the scene with sharp, calculating eyes, taking in the crowd, the flashing cameras, and the officers standing on edge. He strode forward with purpose, his presence shifting the energy. The crowd murmured, unsure of what his arrival meant. Marcus noticed him immediately. He straightened his posture, but didn't move from his spot in front of Angela. "And who's this supposed to be?" he asked quietly, his voice calm but guarded. "That's the captain," Jenkins answered, his tone quieter now. "If anyone can make a decision here, it's him." Rodriguez stopped in front of Jenkins and Logan, his expression unreadable. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Jenkins stepped forward, trying to keep his explanation measured. "Captain, there's been an incident involving Officer Logan. We're gathering statements and—" "An incident?" Rodriguez interrupted, his tone sharp. He turned his gaze to Logan, who stood rigid but visibly nervous. "What kind of incident?" Derek fumbled for words, his earlier defiance replaced with a growing sense of dread. "I was responding to a situation," he began, his voice cracking. This woman was acting suspicious. Rodriguez raised a hand to silence him. "I'm not asking for excuses. I'm asking for facts." The captain's no-nonsense approach sent a ripple through the crowd, many of whom watched with renewed interest. Kayla, the journalist, adjusted her camera angle, sensing the story was far from over. Rodriguez's arrival had added a new layer of unpredictability. Angela stepped forward, her voice steady despite the emotions simmering beneath the surface. "The fact is your officer assaulted me without cause," she said, looking directly at Rodriguez. "And now he's trying to twist the story to cover it up." Rodriguez turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "I understand," he said, his tone respectful. "And I promise you, Mrs. Carter, this will be addressed." But Marcus wasn't convinced. "Addressed how?" he demanded. "With another internal review?" "With more excuses. We've heard those promises before, Captain." Rodriguez met Marcus's gaze, unflinching. "I don't make promises I can't keep," he said. "But if we want to get to the truth, we need to let the process work." Marcus let out a humorless laugh. "The process," he repeated. "That's the problem. The process isn't designed to work for people like us." Before Rodriguez could respond, a commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. A man pushed his way forward, his voice loud and agitated. "You want the truth? I'll give you the truth." It was another officer, Detective Harper, known for his brash demeanor and history of clashing with Logan. His sudden appearance sent a wave of confusion through the gathering. "What are you doing here, Harper?" Rodriguez asked, his tone laced with suspicion. Harper ignored him, pointing directly at Logan. This isn't the first time he's done something like this, and you know it, he said, his voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. You've been covering for him for years, Captain. How much longer are you going to let it slide? The crowd gasped, their murmurs swelling into a roar. Logan's face turned ashen, and even Rodriguez looked momentarily thrown. That's enough, Harper, Rodriguez said sharply, but the damage was done. Marcus stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. What's he talking about? He asked, his voice cutting through the noise. What else has Logan done? Harper hesitated, realizing he had crossed a line, but there was no going back now. You want the truth, he said, looking directly at Marcus. Logan's got a history, complaints, use of force incidents, all buried because it's easier to protect him than to admit there's a problem. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. The crowd erupted, their anger reaching a boiling point. Chants of justice now, and no more cover-ups. Filled the air, their voices rising in Unan looked like a man cornered. Rodriguez raised his hands, trying to regain control. Everyone, calm down, he shouted, but his voice was barely heard over the chaos. Marcus turned to the captain, his expression a mix of anger and determination. This is why we don't trust your process, he said, because it protects people like him. Jenkins raised his hands in a placating gesture. I understand your frustration, he said, though the look in Marcus' eyes made him falter. But these things take time. There's a process. Marcus shook his head, his patience wearing thin. A process? He repeated, his voice rising. The process is broken. We've seen it fail time and time again. The crowd erupted in agreement, their voices growing louder. Justice now, someone shouted. Others joined in, their chants swelling until they seemed to echo off the buildings around them. Logan, hearing the chants, felt his anger flare. He stepped forward, breaking the unspoken barrier between him and the crowd. I did nothing wrong, he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. You're all turning this into something it's not. Marcus turned slowly, his expression cold and unyielding. You laid hands on my mother, he said, each word deliberate and sharp. That's not nothing, and you're going to answer for it. Derek's face twisted, his defenses crumbling under the weight of the moment. She was being difficult, he said, his voice rising in desperation. I was just doing my job. The crowd erupted again, their outrage drowning out anything else he might have said. Angela's hand tightened on Marcus's arm, but he didn't move. His gaze remained locked on Derek, his fists clenched at his sides. Officer Jenkins quickly stepped between them, his tone urgent. All right, that's enough, he said, addressing both men. Logan, step back. Marcus, I need you to trust me to handle this. Marcus didn't move. And why should I trust you? He asked, his voice steady but filled with challenge. What have you done to prove you're any different? Jenkins hesitated, knowing there was no easy answer. I can't speak for the past, he said finally, but I can promise you this. I'm not going to let tonight end without action. Before Marcus could respond, a new voice rang out, cutting through the noise like a siren. That's not good enough, Officer Jenkins. The crowd turned to see Kayla, the journalist, stepping forward with her phone still recording. Her voice was clear and confident, carrying the authority of someone who had seen too much to be silent. The people here want accountability, not empty promises, and the whole world is watching. Jenkins' expression tightened. He looked from Kayla to the crowd, to Marcus, and finally to Angela. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, the realization dawning that this wasn't just another incident to be filed away. This was a breaking point. Logan, meanwhile, was unraveling. He paced back and forth, his anger bubbling to the surface. This is ridiculous, he muttered, his voice growing louder. I'm the one being attacked here. I'm the one under siege. His outburst only fueled the crowd's anger. Chants of resign and justice now grew louder, their voices a force that couldn't be ignored. Logan's hand hovered near his holster, a reflexive move that sent a ripple of alarm through the onlookers. Jenkins noticed immediately and stepped in front of Derek, his voice low but firm. "Logan, stand down," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You've done enough." Logan's face twisted with rage, but he didn't move. For a moment, the tension reached its breaking point, the air so thick with anticipation it felt like time had stopped. Angela, sensing the danger, stepped forward despite Marcus's protests. Her voice, though quiet, carried an unshakable strength. "Enough," she said, looking directly at Logan. "You've caused enough harm tonight. Don't make it worse." Her words seemed to pierce through the chaos, drawing the attention of everyone present. For a brief moment, even Derek seemed to falter, his bravado cracking under the weight of her gaze. But just as it seemed the situation might de-escalate, a shout rang out from the back of the crowd. "We've had enough of this." A group of younger men, emboldened by the injustice they had witnessed, began pushing their way forward, their frustration threatening to boil over. Marcus turned, his voice firm but urgent. "No, that's not the way." He raised his hands, trying to calm them. "We do this the right way, or nothing changes." The group hesitated, their anger palpable but tempered by Marcus's commanding presence. The crowd fell silent again, the moment teetering on the edge of chaos. All eyes were on Marcus, Angela, and Derek, the tension building to a fever pitch. The weight of years of injustice, anger, and pain hung in the air, ready to erupt at any moment. And then a single voice broke the silence. "What happens now?" It was a child's voice, small and questioning, cutting through the noise like a whisper in a storm. The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the night pressed on, heavy with anticipation. But Marcus didn't look away from Derek. His voice, calm but firm, cut through the tension like a blade. "Worse, he put his hands on you, Mom. And for what? Buying groceries." He turned his gaze back to Derek. "Officer, you need to explain yourself. Right now." Derek tried to regain some semblance of control, straightening his posture. "She was being uncooperative," he said, his voice wavering despite his effort to sound authoritative. "I asked her a simple question, and she refused to comply." "She didn't refuse anything," Marcus shot back. "She asked you a question, and instead of answering, you thought you could intimidate her. You thought wrong." The crowd murmured in agreement, their whispers carrying a mix of outrage and disbelief. A young woman in the front held up her phone, recording the entire interaction. The sight of the camera made Derek's jaw tighten, his earlier confidence slipping further away. Angela stepped forward, her hand lightly resting on Marcus's arm. "Marcus, please," she said again, her eyes pleading with him. "I'm fine. Let's just go." Marcus didn't move, his eyes still locked on Derek. "Fine isn't good enough, Mom. He crossed a line, and he needs to be held accountable." Derek's hand twitched near his radio again, but before he could make a move, a voice called out from the crowd. "We've seen enough, officer. You've got no reason to be doing this." It was Mr. Hayes, the elderly man Angela had greeted earlier. His weathered face was set with determination as he stepped forward, leaning on his cane. "You've been pulling this kind of nonsense for years," Hayes continued, pointing at Derek. "But now you've gone too far. You think you can get away with it because of that badge? Not today." Derek's face flushed a deep red, his eyes darting between Marcus, Angela, and the growing crowd. His authority, once unquestioned in situations like this, was slipping away by the second. But instead of apologizing or backing down, he doubled down. "You all need to disperse. This is an active police investigation." Marcus let out a short, humorless laugh. "Investigation? Into what? Buying groceries while black. We both know that's all this is about." Angela gasped quietly at her son's boldness. She had always admired his strength, but right now she feared where it might lead. Marcus was no stranger to standing up for what was right, but this time he wasn't dealing with a faceless enemy on foreign soil. This was home, and the stakes felt infinitely higher. Derek shifted uncomfortably, his bravado faltering. The reality of the situation was starting to dawn on him. Marcus wasn't just some hot-headed kid he could intimidate. This man was different, and the crowd was not on his side. "What's your name, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Derek didn't answer immediately, his mouth opening and closing, as if searching for an excuse. "Your name," Marcus repeated, stepping closer. "It's on your badge, but I'd like to hear you say it." For a moment, it seemed Derek might refuse. But then, under the weight of Marcus's gaze and the watchful eyes of the crowd, he relented. "Logan. Officer Derek Logan," he muttered, barely audible. "Good," Marcus said, his tone steady. "Now, Officer Logan, you're going to explain to my mother, to me, and to everyone here why you thought it was okay to lay hands on her. And you're going to do it before I file a formal complaint." Derek opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The truth was, he didn't have a valid reason. His actions had been driven by impulse, by assumptions, by the deep-seated biases he'd carried for years. And now, standing before Marcus, he realized just how much trouble he was in. Angela, ever the peacemaker, tried once more to defuse the situation. "Marcus, please, let it go. We can handle this another way." But Marcus shook his head. "No, Mom. This has been happening for too long. To you, to me, to everyone who looks like us. It stops now." The weight of his words hung in the air, pressing down on everyone present. Even Derek seemed to feel it, his earlier bluster replaced by a nervous energy that betrayed his growing fear. He had underestimated the people he was dealing with, and now he was facing the consequences. The sound of distant sirens broke the tension, growing louder as they approached. Someone in the crowd must have called for backup, and now more officers were on their way. The crowd began to shift uneasily, some stepping back while others held their ground. Angela's heart raced as she looked at her son. She could see the determination in his eyes, the unshakable resolve that had carried him through battles far worse than this. But she also saw the danger. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about something bigger, something that had been building for years. The revelation hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the gathering as people realized the scope of what Harper was implying. Marcus's eyes narrowed, his fists clenching at his sides. "You're telling me you've had proof of this the whole time, and you're only bringing it up now?" "I didn't have access until recently," Harper said, his voice defensive but resolute. "And believe me, I'm just as angry as you are. That's why I'm here." Rodriguez's expression hardened. "Harper, you're out of line," he said sharply. "We don't air internal matters in public like this." "Maybe that's the problem," Harper shot back. "Maybe if we had, things wouldn't have gotten this far." The captain's face darkened, but before he could respond, Marcus stepped between them. "Play it," he said, his voice like steel. "Whatever's on that drive, we all deserve to see it." Harper hesitated, then nodded. He pulled a small tablet from his bag and inserted the USB drive. The crowd surged closer, their curiosity outweighing their frustration. As the screen flickered to life, the first video began to play, a body cam recording showing Logan berating and roughing up a young man during a routine traffic stop. The footage was raw and unfiltered, the audio capturing Logan's aggressive tone and the young man's pleas for calm. The crowd fell silent, the weight of what they were seeing sinking in. Harper played clip after clip, each one more damning than the last. Instances of excessive force, racial profiling, and outright abuse flashed across the screen, painting a picture of a man who had been allowed to operate unchecked for far too long. Angela's hand flew to her mouth as she watched, her eyes welling with tears. Marcus stood rigid beside her, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. And no one stopped him. Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "You all let this happen." Rodriguez looked away, his face pale. For the first time that night, the captain seemed genuinely shaken. "I didn't know," he muttered, but the words felt hollow even to him. "You didn't want asterisk to know," Marcus said, his voice rising. "Because it was easier to look the other way, because you didn't care who got hurt." The crowd erupted again, their voices filled with anger and heartbreak. Harper turned off the tablet, his face grim. "This is just the start," he said. "If we don't act now, it'll only get worse." But before anyone could respond, a loud metallic clang rang out, silencing the crowd. The squad car holding Logan had been struck from behind by another vehicle, a dark SUV that screeched to a halt. The back door flew open, and two masked men jumped out, their movements swift and calculated. Chaos erupted as the men pulled Logan from the car, dragging him toward the SUV. "Get back," one of them shouted, brandishing a weapon. The crowd screamed and scattered, some ducking for cover while others froze in shock. Marcus, instinctively protective, pulled Angela behind him. "Stay here," he said firmly before stepping toward the chaos. "Hey, let him go." The masked men ignored him, shoving Logan into the SUV and slamming the door. The vehicle rolled to life, its tires screeching as it sped away into the night. The entire scene unfolded in seconds, leaving everyone stunned and speechless. Rodriguez grabbed his radio, barking orders for backup and roadblocks. But as the SUV disappeared into the darkness, it became clear that Logan wasn't just a rogue cop. He was part of something much bigger. Marcus stared after the vehicle, his mind racing. The night had taken an unexpected turn, and now the battle for justice was more complicated than he'd ever imagined. Whatever came next, he knew they were far from the end of the story. "Would you like me to explore this twist further or focus on tying up additional loose ends?" The crowd was left in stunned silence, their voices swallowed by the roar of the SUV as it disappeared into the night. For a moment, it felt as though time had stopped, the chaos hanging heavily in the air. Angela clutched Marcus's arm tightly, her breaths shallow and uneven. Around them, murmurs began to rise, laced with fear and confusion. Marcus turned to Captain Rodriguez, his voice sharp and urgent. Who were those men? Why would they take him? Rodriguez's face was pale, his usually steady demeanor shaken. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice strained. But this just got a lot more complicated. Kayla, ever the journalist, moved closer, her camera still rolling. "Complicated? That's an understatement," she said, her tone biting. "An officer just got abducted in front of an entire town. What are you going to do about it?" Rodriguez ignored her, barking orders into his radio for immediate pursuit. Officers scrambled to respond, their vehicles pulling away with sirens blaring, but it was clear they were already too far behind. Logan's abduction wasn't a random act. It was planned, precise, and executed with. Angela's trembling voice broke through the tension. "Marcus, let's go home," she whispered, her eyes pleading. "This isn't our fight anymore." Marcus shook his head, his jaw tight. "It's everyone's fight, Mom. What happened tonight isn't just about Logan. It's about all of us. If we walk away now, nothing changes." Angela hesitated, her heart torn between her fear for her son and her own growing resolve. She had spent years quietly enduring injustice, but tonight had pushed her past her limit. "What do we do then?" she asked softly. "How do we fix something this broken?" Before Marcus could answer, Harper stepped forward, his expression grim. "The system's not going to fix itself," he said, "but we can force it to change, starting with what's on that drive." Kayla immediately perked up, her instincts as a storyteller kicking in. "If what you're saying is true, that evidence could blow this whole thing wide open, but it won't matter unless people see it." Marcus turned to her, his brow furrowed. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we make sure they can't bury it," Kayla said. "I can publish the footage, share the reports. Once it's out there, they won't be able to hide anymore." Rodriguez's voice cut in sharply. "That's not how this works. Evidence like that needs to go through proper channels." Marcus turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "The same proper channels that let Logan keep his badge for years. No, this isn't about protecting the system, it's about exposing it." The captain opened his mouth to argue, but the determination in Marcus's voice left him speechless. Harper handed the USB drive to Kayla, his movements deliberate. "Do what you have to do," he said. "Just make sure the truth comes out." As Kayla slipped the drive into her bag, the weight of the moment settled over everyone. There was no going back now. The crowd, still lingering on the edges, began to disperse, their murmurs filled with equal parts hope and uncertainty. The night's events had shaken the town to its core, but the fight for justice was far from over. Angela tugged gently on Marcus's arm. "Let's go home," she said again, her voice steadier this time. Marcus nodded reluctantly, his protective instincts still on high alert. Together, they walked toward their car, the hum of distant sirens fading into the night. The next morning, the town awoke to a storm of headlines. Kayla's footage had gone viral, the images and videos from the USB drive sparking outrage across the nation. News outlets picked up the story, dissecting every detail of Logan's actions and the broader implications for the department. Protests erupted in major cities, fueled by a growing demand for accountability. Angela watched the news from her living room, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The footage was difficult to watch, but she couldn't look away. It was her story, her truth, finally being told. Marcus sat beside her, his arms crossed as he stared at the screen. "They're listening now," he said, his voice heavy. "But it shouldn't have taken this much." Angela nodded, her gaze distant. "No, it shouldn't have. But at least it's a start." As the days passed, the pressure on the precinct mounted. Captain Rodriguez was called to testify before an independent review board, and Harper's revelations about internal cover-ups became the centerpiece of a federal investigation. The department issued a public apology, but for many in the community, words weren't enough. Angela returned to the diner, her co-workers greeting her with hugs and words of support. Customers stopped by her table to thank her for standing up, their words giving her a strength she hadn't realized she possessed. She didn't see herself as a hero, just a mother who had done what was right. Marcus, meanwhile, found himself at the center of the movement. People looked to him for guidance, drawn to his calm strength and unwavering sense of justice. Though he hadn't sought the spotlight, he embraced the role, knowing it was an opportunity to create real change. Weeks later, Logan was found. He had been left unharmed in a remote area, his abductor's motives still unclear. Speculation swirled, but no one claimed responsibility. Logan's career was over, his name forever tied to disgrace. For Marcus and Angela, his fate was secondary to the larger battle. In the end, the town of Maplewood wasn't the same. The events of that night had shaken the community, but they had also sparked a movement that couldn't be silenced. People began attending town hall meetings, demanding transparency and reform. Angela joined those meetings, her voice stronger than it had ever been. As Marcus prepared to leave for another rally, Angela stopped him at the door. "You've done so much already," she said, her eyes filled with pride. "Don't forget to take care of yourself too." Marcus smiled, pulling her into a hug. "I will, Mom. But this fight, it's for you. For Al."